punk changed everything.
I think that it is a facet that changed classic rock.
You had artists like Patti Smith, you had artists like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Damned, all shoving their nose at the artists that came before them.
The origins of punk rock, it's not clear exactly where it started. Could be Detroit, could be New York, could be London. Typically it's narrowed down to CBGB's, or the old CBGB's in New York City before it was shut down, and the 100 Club in London. By 1977-78, punk rock emerged from the underground and quickly became one of the most influential subgenres in rock and roll.
The punk explosion in 1977 had a strong impact, and some would say even stopped the progressive rock movement at that point.
The reason punk rock is so important in the story of classic rock is that punk is often regarded as the end point of the classic rock era. It's regarded as the thing which killed classic rock.
I think that's an excellent marker. Punk, classic rock, punk, and then everything that came after.
You needed punk in order to show what had happened beforehand.
Rock up until that point, mainstream rock, had become extremely complicated and extremely hard to break into. So punk comes along, which is the next generation, and says, no. We're going to just get up there and do what we want to do because we feel like it.
Making music and making loud music, which is, you know, that big important part of being in a rock band, is that feeling of like making something powerful.
People understood that this new form of music has this very sexy, rebellious, edgy, avant-garde, challenging yet completely universal quality to it, you know?
The classic rock radio format was first broadcast in Cleveland, Ohio in 1980. Cleveland's AOR station, M105.7, was the very first to rebrand itself as a classic rock station, followed by Chicago's WMET in 1981. Punk and new wave were so sonically different from the rock and roll before it that classic rock radio was developed in order to market the rock prior to punk separately. And so going back to the original point about how classic rock stations are now including grunge bands and alternative bands from the 90s and 2000s even, really, I mean, the fact that even punk from the late 70s and 80s is being included, that in itself is kind of like, well, that's not really classic rock. Is it?
I do think that as time has gone on, the word classic rock has broadened a little bit, you know?
What happened, I think, is that we had a very direct line from the blues to early rock and roll.
And then from that, though, it's accelerated and has branched off into all these different offshoots.
The debate is ongoing as to where exactly the classic rock era ends. But overwhelmingly, there is a consensus that the punk movement, at the very least, does signify the beginning of the end of the classic rock era.
So I think in 1977, 78, the story was that a lot of these punk bands just wanted to deny, to a certain extent, what had happened before them and start fresh. Start at ground zero, start at number one, and work their way forward. But I think as time went on, you realized that it wasn't so much the case. The Sex Pistols, when they met up with Pete Townsend from The Who, were both scared to meet one another because they thought that they were both enemies of music. Pete was afraid that the Sex Pistols would beat him up. The Sex Pistols were afraid that Pete would look at them and call them snot nose. It turned out that they had a pretty good mutual respect because they still did the same things. They still wanted to connect to the audience that they believed that nobody else was reaching at the time. When you look at Patty's history, she took a lot of the music of the early Stones, especially with the look and the feel of somebody like Keith Richards or Mick Jagger, and turned it into her own. The Clash used a lot of reggae music from the early 70s and a lot of the music that they grew up on, and they wanted to be a stadium band just as much as anybody else does. So I think it's a little bit of both. You know, history has not necessarily been kind to the music of punk, but I think it's been kind to the aesthetic and the reasoning behind why punk had to exist.
So because of all these influences, specifically this Patti Smith, Rolling Stones, would you say that they should be included in the story of classic rock, perhaps, Paul?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those punk bands have to be included in the story of classic rock. In the 70s, it was still okay to like the Beatles, but they weren't being obsessively watched and listened to as much. They needed to kind of go away for a little bit. You still had the solo careers of all four members. You know, Ringo Starr was doing his thing. Paul McCartney was a little bit, you know, taking a little bit less risks. I mean, at the time, probably John Lennon and George Harrison was doing more to stretch the boundaries of rock music than the others. They had all punk attitudes, which is, I'm going to do this on my own. As long as you were believing in your art, and as long as you were as authentic as can be, and you used different aspects of art, whether it was painters that influenced you, or whether it was dance troupes that influenced your videos like Talking Heads did. As long as you were true to that, like the punks were, and like the Beatles were, and the Who was, it was easy to get your message across. So punk didn't actually destroy classic rock. It did probably for a little bit of time, but classic rock wasn't even in anybody's thoughts, because it was still okay to like Led Zeppelin, even though that they were parading around in giant jumbo jets, you know, pillaging towns as they came in, or the Rolling Stones making gobs of money, you know, being jet setters and being on the fashion pages as much as Cream magazine or Rolling Stone. So at first glance, where it looked like that punk music was kind of trying to destroy that, they both needed each other. You know, they both needed to have them both at the same time, just as much as Nirvana somewhat needed to have all those hair bands and the metal hard rock band that they were so-called rallying against in order to exist in the first place.
In your minds, do you think that the punk rock attitude affected hard rock going forward post 77?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there has to be
the Clash and the Ramones.
Yeah, but there's a generation gap between the bands because all those bands that were, like, I remember Iron Maiden or something, you read quotes about them and how they despised punk rock because they felt like it was intellectually inferior in a musical sense. And I think it took like probably an additional 10 years before younger bands started to really appreciate those punk rock bands and understand them. I don't think the bands at the time were really affected by them unless it was negative.
I don't know. I mean, I think it just always kind of perpetuates itself. And I remember listening to, you know, Nevermind the Bollocks when I was a kid again by my brother, and just thinking, like, I didn't get it, but I wanted to get it. You know, like, it was loud and it was brash, but there was still melody, there was still something I could sing along with, but I could feel something in me, you know. But that also happened when I bought It Takes a Nation, a Million Souls back by Public Enemy. Like, I had exactly the same kind of feeling. And that's why I think punk rock and hip hop, but that's a whole other documentary. But yeah, no, I think that it's definitely affected. You know, you listen to, like, Eddie Vedder inducted the Ramones into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and did like a big speech for them, you know, and they are like a grunge, quote unquote, hard rock band, but they were affected by the Pistols.
All those,
you know,
grunge bands were affected by the punk rock scene.
And
like
the Ramones and the Clash.
Pixies.
Yeah, absolutely. It all, but that's what I was saying, you know, earlier on. It's like, there are so many offshoots now. There are so many extensions where everything touches it now. You know, and people always say to us, "Oh, you're like a punk band." I'm like, well, not really. We have a punk ethos to a certain extent. You know, we've always kind of operated the way we've wanted to do and do whatever we want to do, which is a mindset. But we love Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin as much as we love the Clash and the Ramones.
And Rage Against the Machine is probably the most influential band that has affected us, and they're definitely not a punk rock band.
If we go through the history of rock and roll, there are several watershed moments. I mean, there's Elvis, there's the Beatles, there's Woodstock, and then we get to punk. Punk was the last great evolution in the rock and roll sound. I mean, there have been other things that have happened since then, but they've mostly been derivative of things that happened before. I mean, the punk rock revival of the middle 1990s, grunge was just a variation on a certain type of heavy metal. Indie rock was really nothing more than the sensibilities of the Beatles brought into the 21st century. So we haven't really seen in the rock and roll genre, the idiom that is rock and roll, any real change since 1977, 78. So this has brought a lot of people to the conclusion that rock is dead. It hasn't evolved in 40 years. Is that true, or are we just seeing, is rock at a stage of its evolution where we just have each generation successively rediscovering something the previous generations already knew about? I'll tell you what a lot of people misunderstand about punk. It was a revolutionary thing, but it was revolutionary by being reactionary. What it did was strip back rock and roll to its rock and roll basics, the stuff that we used to see in the 50s and 60s. Forget about having to learn how to play an instrument. Forget about having a good singing voice. Forget about having some kind of theatrical performance. We have something to say, and we're going to say it. And that was really all that punk really was all about. And that's what rock and roll was really all about in its early days. So again, revolutionary by being reactionary.
I remember at the time, I was kind of resisting that the whole punk influence on it. But then one day, this pal of mine was playing. I was over at his house, and he was playing "Nevermind the Bollocks," the Sex Pistols album, and suddenly the penny dropped, and I got it. I felt like, oh yeah, this is what it's supposed to be at its core. It's still supposed to be fun, and it's supposed to be entertainment. And you can become so technically proficient that you lose that fundamental aspect of it if you get your head too far up into the Bach end of things. So I would say it then from that point on, the balancing of the two became really essential. And I think some great progressive bands, Genesis for one, were able to pull that off.
I think the punk movement actually expanded the hard rock movement. I think that by virtue of they were so off base from what the rock movement was doing, musically speaking, that it attracted a whole new set of people into the fan base, so to speak, and the people that would go buy records. Because if you liked punk, you really didn't like hard rock. So I think it was a very valuable addition to the musical scene because there was room for it.
In your mind, what about the punk rock attitude from '77 influenced classic rock moving forward?
More or less taking risks and knowing that you can follow your heart and say things that maybe are going to push people and challenge people and to make them think a little bit more. And also that songs don't need to be, 10-minute opuses. They can be, 2.5 minutes of this badass kind of straightforward kind of knock you in the face with a brick. And so I guess a lot of the modern day classic rock bands maybe got that energy, that lightning in a bottle kind of thing.
Let's be very clear that punk rock started in the United States. It started in New York mainly, around CBGB's, Mercer Art Center, Max's Kansas City, Mud Club, those kind of places, in the scuzzier parts of town. And what people forget, or what some people forget, is that originally punk American style was not very political at all. In fact, it was an art movement. It was performance art.
when the punk scene happened, we knew what the Ramones were about. We knew what the Dictators were about. This wasn't a political statement. This was kind of like a, we can't play very well. We think Foreigners sucks. You know, we think corporate rock is like nauseating, and we want to play 3 chords, and we love Phil Spector and the Ronettes or whatever. Or it was the Handsome Dick Manitoba and his funny view of the world through the eyes of Andy Chernoff. They were funny stuff. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't political. It was just kind of funny.
There was definitely a different attitude in American punk and English punk. English punk was very much against society. You know, I mean, Johnny Rotten went on nationwide TV and said the F word, you know, and that just wasn't done on the BBC, you know. And, you know, it was all the electric hair and the piercings and flicking razor blades at people. I think they were anti this country. It started here.
England.
Yeah, you know, the Sex Pistols and all that. So they became anti-establishment. They were angry. And instead of in the 60s where the young people got mad in the 60s and in the 67s and all that, and they turned it into love. Okay? Peace and love. And they got mad again all over in the 80s again, late 70s, 80s, and they turned it into hate. Because punk rock was all about hate. It's all about aggro. You know, with the piercings everywhere and spitting on people, and that's what that was. That's what the English was. English was anti-establishment, the punk movement. In America, it was a little bit more of a business.
The people in the UK, the young people in the UK, saw this as a way of getting back at their betters. It became very political and very class-driven. So while it was this art movement in the United States, it became something more of a youth culture, political, class, screw the rich movement in the UK, which resulted in 2 different types of music. In the UK, it was very hard for those bands to make it in the United States because they were far too violent, far too political, far too weird, far too provocative. Meanwhile, the American bands, with the exception of the Ramones and a few others, weren't political enough and class conscious enough to make it in the UK. And the interesting thing that came out of all of this is that the quieter, milder, poppier, hookier bands in the UK came to the US as new wave bands, which was another marketing term, which was created by Sire Records, and which is the company that signed people like Morrissey and the Pretenders and the Smiths and a whole bunch of others, and the English Beat. This was a way of taking the angry stuff, or the less angry stuff from the UK, and making it palatable to American audiences.
And then Twisted Sister, ironically enough, was signed by a punk label in England because they saw us as revolutionary and insane, and they put us on a label with the Exploited and the Cockney Rejects. It doesn't get much more punk than that. These guys were starving to death. The members of the Exploited was our road crew during our first tour. Wonderful guys. We were in London in 1982. Went to the clubs. Everybody had mohawks, and it was a great scene. But I can't say that we looked at it in any other way other than, wow, that's kind of an interesting scene. But that's not our scene.
In your mind, what distinguishes the UK punk movement from the US punk movement?
I think the UK punk movement versus the US one, at the time, in those early 70s, in the UK, it was a pretty dark time. There was a lot of unemployment and a lot of disenfranchisation against the government. And that music came up, and its voice was, let's rally against what we see as wrong. In the United States and in Canada, and Hamilton here, where punk was strong, it wasn't as politically motivated. I think there was undertones of that, but it was more of a community motivation in Canada and the United States of rallying people around punk rock that felt they were in the same headspace, that they had the same beliefs and they were looking forward to the same things. Yeah, I think there was always a rebellion aspect because that's what the kids at the time wanted to do, right? You always want to change and rebel, and I think how you expected to act and grow up in the States and Canada, that's what punk kind of rebelled against. And this government and government action in the UK was what punk rebelled against there.
One of the things CBS Records had a real tough time with was The Clash. The Clash was quite successful in the UK for a band of their type in 1977. But for the Americans, which were in the midst of the whole disco explosion, I mean, CBS Records says, we can't sell this stuff. American audiences aren't going to buy this stuff. It's too angry, it's too fierce, it's too political, it's too much of a downer. I mean, we're all dancing here. I mean, it's all about Bee Gees and Gloria Gaynor right now. What are you trying to do to us? So the Clash had a real hard time. It was hard to get anything from the Clash except as an import in the United States for a very, very long time. So what happened was that the people at Sire Records, which was run by a guy named Seymour Stein, and Sire was this independent record label out of New York, and they said, there's all this great music that's happening in the UK, but we're going to have to find a way to market it in the United States, because if we say punk, well, it just conjures up visions of people with mohawks and safety pins through their clothes. That's just not gonna sell here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the more palatable acts that have come out of the punk rock era in Britain, and we are going to package them and sell them in America as new wave. Now, new wave is strictly a North American term. It never caught on in the UK. They talked about things like post-punk and post-modern and a whole bunch of other things. But the word that we used in North America was new wave. And that's where we got your Elvis Costello. That's where we got your Pretenders. That's where we got your Smiths. That's where we got your English Beat. And all these other bands that came out of punk but weren't as violent or as political or as class conscious. They were new and fresh and cool and interesting. And definitely, by listening to these new wave bands, you could tell that punk had happened, but you just didn't call it punk. There's a technical and sonic difference between punk and new wave. Punk was 2 chords, maybe 3, played really fast, and the message was, fuck you. New wave was a whole bunch of different chords added in, a lot more pop sensibilities with the melodies and the song structure, and it was either things are fucking great or we're fucked. Completely different attitude and presentation, but again, by listening to new wave, you could tell that punk had been there before them.
As far as the whole punk movement and my take on it and what I saw and where I was coming from with it, I had in 1975, I think it was, moved with I was in a group called Clover, and we moved to Great Britain. We moved to England. And we moved over there and we recorded a couple of our albums for Phonogram UK, and we lived over there for a few years. But we were the band on Elvis Costello's My Aim Is True album, his debut album. And so I played all the lead guitar and pedal steel and everything on Elvis's first album. Which is, some people consider that to be a punk record, or certainly a new wave. And so here's this California, hippie band, a hillbilly hippie band. We were the band on his debut album, and which was like a Rolling Stone magazine album of the year and stuff like that, and it's gone gold and platinum all over the world. So, I was part of something that is actually considered to be iconic in that realm, but here we had moved to Britain, and right when the punk thing, really wrong timing for us, because we were a lot more like, I don't know, maybe like the Eagles or something than the Sex Pistols. So all of a sudden we were like totally in the wrong place at the wrong time. But we ended up being part of the scene anyway, musically speaking. But it was, you're right. One thing that was lacking maybe in some of all the energy, which was cool, and the attitude of some of the new wave stuff and the punk, if you want to call it that. We're looking at labels again, but there's missing, for the most part, some musicianship, and that's what I think, us older folks, that was more important to us maybe. I don't know exactly why, but that's, I don't mean to be critical of a genre or any particular artists or anything, but just as an observation, I think for me there was a little bit lacking in terms of musicianship. But it's kind of cool when music gets pulled one way or another. At least it was music. At least it was really real people playing instruments, and that's one of the things that I have an issue with. I don't like records where there's nobody that can actually sing on the record, nobody that can actually play. there's nothing real about it. And that people are having hits with that, you know? That's crazy.
There's always the ante to what's popular, okay? Even if what's popular is good and legitimate, okay? In the sense of punk, I feel like I love that it was guitars. I didn't care for, you know, the fashion statement of piercing every part of your body, okay? But it was still, it was a reaction to, you know, maybe it's the success and the pompous nature of these rock stars with their own jets and you know, and 50 people on the crew touring around, which is not where they came from. Maybe that just felt very wrong to some people, and the best way, they're still using the right tool, a guitar, and they're still singing, even if they're screaming, okay? But they kind of really did turn it upside down, stripped it down, and made their own movement. And the fact that they were different, there's the attention, you know, and some of it actually worked. I mean, bands like the Sex Pistols and Clash, they did wind up having radio hits, oddly enough. In the same way that the Beatles eventually shed the suits and then became just completely like, wore whatever they wanted and made everybody like get away from neat and tidy, okay? Now it became, you know, somebody else had to strip it down again. And hence, I think the punk, you know, movement really stripped it down, you know, and everybody got pretty extreme.
What did the punk movement do?
There must have been a backlash in some of the bands from the punk thing to just be, you didn't have to be a great player, you didn't have to be a great singer, it was all about some sort of angst, energy, anger. Some of it I know came out that they weren't happy with the politics in England, and those bands were very much FU to the you know, the whole British hierarchy and everything. It's interesting that a style of music that's so not classic rock, even though Aerosmith proved that you can make something that's kind of cool and rock and make it a rap song, like Walk This Way would Run DMC, but that whole rap, you know, genre of music started out also being an FU to society. Just in general, it was a way of them expressing their anger and angst, like punk. I see it that way. So there's always this edge to certain new movements of music that seems to resonate with people, and truly, in some ways, the rappers became the rock stars of that generation for those people, because they were the ones they looked up to. They were kind of dangerous, and the punk definitely stripped down rock and roll.
Thank God for punk. I think punk saved us from the disco era, because after that whole first era you were just talking about, suddenly the disco movement started coming in, and then Ramones and the Police showed up and totally diverted everyone from that whole disco thing. The disco, it had its little moment, but it didn't last very long because of the punk era. And I think I'm so happy about that, because I, for one, am not a synthesizer keyboards fan at all. So to hear, once again, the raw, just in your face, pure rock and roll punk sound was refreshing. I think they kept music, rock, classic rock, alive for a few more years, which was great. And then came the grunge movement. So
do you think that punk itself is part of classic rock, or is it just another facet of rock and roll that changed the direction of classic rock? What are your perspectives? Does that question make sense?
yeah, it does, and it's an interesting question. I don't necessarily see punk as classic rock. It's just my first thoughts on it. I think that it is a facet that changed classic rock, but I don't think it's necessarily regarded as classic rock. To me, classic rock is very defined by the guitar riffs. And if you listen to punk, a lot of it's just power chords, downstrokes, fast, da-da-da-da-da. And there's not a lot of melody. It's more just cool chords, 2-minute long, little anthems.
Really, punk rock followed hot on the heels of glam rock, to tell you the truth. That's what it followed on. And that's where, I mean, I get classified in the glam rock era only because my hits were at that time. That came from the Ziggy Stardust stuff, you know, and the platform heels and everything, the boys dressed up with makeup and this and that and this and that. So then punk went exactly anti-establishment. They went anti-establishment at that point. I think it was a direct result of what was happening at that point in music, not progressive rock. That was before that. Punk followed my first hits. That was the next thing, and they called me the early punk rocker with the leather jumpsuit and the bass guitar, and that's what they call me, but I don't see myself as punk at all. I just see myself as based in rock. In the 70s, you had all your different, you had your glam rock, you had your progressive rock, you had your sweet girl singers, you had, I mean, you had a lot of different kinds of music.
All right, so the reason why I think punk isn't part of the language of classic rock necessarily is because the years of punk, which is 76, 77 to 80, in middle America wasn't as resonant as it was in New York City and maybe Chicago or maybe LA, you know, maybe Miami. I mean, where the urban centers are. It was back in the, you know, in those, in middle America, it was Foreigner, REO Speedwagon, you know, certainly Kiss was part of that. Bob Seger was part of it. It was a different rock movement. It was much more mainstreamish or corporate rock. So punk itself wasn't necessarily resonating. If you look at Epic Records, they said the Clash was the world's most important band, and yet on Epic Records, Cheap Trick sold way more records than the Clash did. Okay, Cheap Trick was a Midwestern, the archetype of a Midwestern band. Nugent was Midwestern. These artists were selling bucket loads of records, and these people remain stalwarts of classic rock.
I don't think we can have another Beatles or another Led Zeppelin or another U2, but you know, that those are just numbers. Those are numbers, but I'm not talking about artistically. Artistically, you know, there's bands that I love just as much as the Beatles that move me just as much, or you know, like I hear them creating art that is incredibly inspired. So yeah, there's no question that there's still artists that come around that could move the needle and either make music or make an artistic or social statement. Yeah, I mean, even before Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, you had the Sex Pistols. I remember like the late 70s, Prague was killed off and disco was huge, and then the punk movement came around, and like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Ramones just changed everything. And then it happened again in the 90s with the grunge movement and Kurt Cobain and all the other bands that followed in that way. Yeah, they'll always be an outlet for you know, musicians or artists that have a social voice or that do things that are extreme to really excite people. Yeah, that'll never change.
It is a bit of a misnomer, a bit of a myth that, you know, Britain was in great economic decline since the end of World War II. That's actually not true. The first couple of decades after World War II generally characterized by, you know, economic prosperity in the UK. By the late 60s and early 70s, that did start to change, and it changed for all sorts of reasons, competition from other countries like Germany and so on. But then also really characterized by the late 1970s by staggering rates of inflation, a very, very you know, high rate of unemployment, particularly in key industries. So the economy of Britain fell on hard times in the late 70s. And I don't think there's any irony that particularly in big urban centers, Manchester, Birmingham, London, that produced a kind of reaction amongst particularly the youth, right, who didn't have the opportunities of their parents, who didn't enjoy the same prosperity, had no prospects of jobs, right, lifelong jobs like their dads had in coal mines or anywhere else. And I think that's very much where the reaction, you know, for punk music comes from. And then you add that, you'd have to add that to the relative decline of Britain as a global power, and of course the social changes of the 1960s. So it's a kind of toxic mix, and I think that's where punk rock comes from.
I think that punk compared to hard rock, musically in the form of playing, is more of a slap in the face, is more of a dramatic presentation of here's what we are and what we do and what we stand for. And because of its slap in the face, it doesn't have the opportunity to be as intricate and as complicated in its playing, but it also allows for non-musicians to pick up the guitar and be a punk rock band, right? With 3 chords and some lyrics, you can bang it out and you can convey your message. If you want to be an intricate rock band with larger bridges and musically take it to another level, then that takes a higher form of playing. It doesn't discount the message from each, but it's somewhat simpler to grab a guitar, bang out 3 chords and scream your message. But it's all based in that form of rebellion and conveying a message.
What was it about the difference from hard rock and punk? Like, what distinguished punk from hard rock, essentially?
I think the major difference are the songs and the musicianship. Like, you could not be able to play very well and play in a punk band. If you knew 3 chords, you were away to the races if you were a guitar player. And pretty much a lot of those guys, that's all they did. But they were angry. You know, that was I think for me anyway, the overall thesis of punk was anger. You look at some of the bands, their lyrics were basically, I'm mad about this and I hate this and I don't want this. So they were like a movement that for the dissatisfied.
Thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkisian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.